Updates concerning Nnamdi Kanu case today.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into a really significant legal decision that just came out of Kenya. This deep dive is all about a landmark ruling concerning, well, the abduction and rendition of Nnamdi Kanu. He's the leader, as you probably know, of the indigenous people of Biafra, or IPOB. Our mission really is for you to quickly get the core facts here, to understand the specific human rights violations the court talked about, and explore the wider implications and the pretty strong reactions we've seen. We want you to finish this deep dive with a really clear sense of why this ruling is, well, so important, especially when we talk about international law and human rights. Right, so to really set the scene for this dramatic ruling, let's go back to the incident itself. Nnamdi Kanu, leader of IPOB. The court was looking specifically at events back in June 2021. That's when he was abducted in Kenya, and then subjected to what they call rendition, basically a forcible transfer back to Nigeria. And what makes this really stand out is that he'd actually entered Kenya legally. He was there as a British citizen before all this happened. It's a whole sequence of events that, as we'll get into, the court found was completely outside the law.
Yeah, and one thing that really jumps out is just how explicit the Kenyan High Court in Nairobi was about these actions. On June 24th, 2025, Justice E.C. Muwira gave this judgment, and didn't mince words at all, said Kanu's abduction, his detention, and then the rendition to Nigeria were unequivocally unlawful and illegal. And this isn't just, some political statement. For a national court to say its own government's actions were illegal in a case like this, a cross-border rendition, that sets a powerful precedent. It's quite rare, actually. It really highlights that even state power has, well, constitutional limits.
And here's where it gets really compelling, because the court didn't just say unlawful and leave it there. It carefully listed out the gross human rights violations. Justice Marta basically held that what both the Kenyan and Nigerian governments did amounted to gross violations of Kanu's fundamental human rights, rights that are actually, protected by their own constitutions. The court found Kenya specifically violated its own 2010 constitution and Kanu's rights. Just listen to this list, abducted, kept in solitary confinement, tortured, denied food and medication, chained, humiliated, ridiculed, held in contempt, and crucially, forcibly removed from Kenya without any due process or legal basis. So no extradition hearing, no judicial warrant mentioned. These are, vital safeguards. They're meant to ensure people get a fair hearing before being shipped between countries, protection against arbitrary state power. And the court found this was a clear violation of his freedom of movement and security of the person.
That explicit declaration of illegality, the unconstitutionality, and then adding that detailed list of human rights violations, yes, that's incredibly significant. For a national court to hold its own government accountable for such a wide range of abuses, it's a profound statement. It really reinforces the idea that states aren't above the law, that constitutional frameworks, especially around fundamental human rights, have to be followed, always. Even in these tricky cross-border situations, I think this judgment could easily become a reference point for other cases where governments are accused of, stepping over their legal boundaries.
Okay, so with such a clear finding on the violations, the court then moved on to compensation. It ordered that Kanu should receive 10 million Kenyan shillings in compensatory damages, and that sum is to be paid by the Attorney General of Kenya, so representing the Kenyan government. Just to give you a sense of that, it's roughly 119.5 million Nigerian naira.
Right, and that immediately raises an important question, doesn't it? What's the actual role, the impact of money, of financial compensation, when you're dealing with such serious human rights violations? Obviously, money can never truly undo the harm of abduction or torture or illegal rendition. That's clear. But what it does do is serve as a formal, tangible acknowledgement by the state that they did something wrong. And it goes beyond just helping the victim. It puts a real cost on these kinds of state abuses, which, might make governments think twice before doing something similar again. It's a legal obligation that, if it's actually enforced, sends a signal about accountability.
So we have the court's findings, the compensation. The next logical step is to look at how the group right at the center of this, the indigenous people of Biafra, IPOB, how they've reacted. They're calling it a landmark victory.
Yeah, and it's fascinating strategically, isn't it? When a group like IPOB takes a domestic court ruling like this and uses it as sort of leverage for this much broader international accountability campaign, they're drawing a very sharp line here. They're insisting this wasn't some legitimate extradition process. They're calling it extraordinary rendition, and their specific description is a criminal act of state-sponsored international terrorism.
Mm.
That's incredibly strong language. It signals they really want to push this conversation beyond just Kenya and Nigeria, aiming for a different kind of justice altogether.
That is incredibly strong language. Now, the court did rule the rendition unlawful, illegal, but how much does the court's actual ruling support that specific claim of state-sponsored international terrorism? Is there a direct link in the judgment, or is this more IPOB's framing for their campaign?
That's a really crucial point. The court's ruling, it focuses very much on the illegality and the unconstitutionality of the actions under Kenyan law, under Nigerian law. It doesn't explicitly label it terrorism or a crime against humanity. No. IPOB using terms like criminal act of state-sponsored international terrorism, that's definitely their strategic framing. It's designed to push for that wider international response. And their call for accountability under the universal principle of accountability for crimes against humanity, that's also very significant. Just so listeners understand, crimes against humanity isn't just like a dramatic phrase. It's a specific legal term for widespread or systematic attacks on civilians. And importantly, it can trigger something called universal jurisdiction, which means potentially individuals involved could be prosecuted anywhere in the world, no matter where the crime happened. So it really shows IPOB's intent here to elevate this beyond just a national human rights issue.
Right, I see. And on that, IPOB is claiming Kanu was grabbed in broad daylight, Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, by Nigerian secret police, and they specifically point to collusion from, quote, rogue elements of the Kenyan security apparatus. They repeat the details. Chain, torture, denied medication, bundled onto a private jet, flown illegally to Abuja, no hearing, no warrant. And they've gone further, linking this verdict to a bigger push for global accountability, even naming specific high-profile people. So what does this all mean, then, for their accusations and this push for global action?
Well, it means IPOB feels this verdict puts, as they put it, a permanent and indelible legal stain on the records of former presidents Uhuru Kenyatta in Kenya, Muhammadu Buhari in Nigeria, and also on the former Attorney General Abubakar Malami in Nigeria. They also directly accuse other Nigerian leaders, naming Buhari, Osinbajo, Tinubu, Shettima, of undertaking, quote, criminal lobbying missions to try and pressure Kenya's judiciary to basically cover it up. IPOB is very clear. They say this is not the end, but actually the beginning of a global accountability campaign. IPO, against everyone they hold responsible, using that universal principle of accountability for crimes against humanity we just talked about. They've also been quite critical of what they call British diplomatic complicity and the cowardly silence from Western powers. While on the other hand, publicly thanking Professor P.L.O. Lumumba, who was their lead counsel, and Justice E.C. Mwita for, as they see it, showing bravery against political pressure.
Okay, so just to summarize then, this Kenyan court ruling on Nnamdi Kanu'S abduction and rendition really stands out because it explicitly calls state actions illegal, unconstitutional, and holds governments accountable for these gross human rights violations. It seems the specific judgment from Kenya gives us a fascinating look at how domestic courts can sometimes push back against, well, powerful state actions.
It certainly does. It reinforces that whole idea that states aren't immune, not even when they act across borders.
Yeah.
And that wins in domestic courts can absolutely fuel these bigger international campaigns for justice. The level of detail on the violations, that explicit declaration of illegality, it provides a really powerful sort of template.
Which leads us to a final thought, something for you, our listener, to maybe chew on. How might this specific judgment coming out of a Kenyan court actually influence the wider global conversation about extraordinary rendition and about the responsibility governments have when people are forcibly moved across borders without any due process? Does this ruling maybe set a new kind of precedent? Could we see more efforts like this, using domestic court rulings to try and hold states accountable for violating fundamental human rights in this way, perhaps paving the way for broader international legal scrutiny? It makes you think about that complex relationship, doesn't it, between national courts and the bigger quest for international justice.
Thanks for watching. If you are coming across my channel for the first time, do well to subscribe, comment, like, and share to your loved ones.